Well, just within the last hour or so, we've had statements from the Ethiopian military chief of staff and also from Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, as you mentioned, saying that they're now in control of the Tigrayan regional capital of Mekelle. Now, there's no access at the moment for humanitarian workers and journalists, so it's very difficult to verify the various claims that both sides have been making. But these statements from the government side come just a few hours after reports of fighting and shelling and airstrikes in the city that you mentioned. The TPLF described it as a heavy bombardment. The government side have repeatedly been saying that they've been taking great care not to harm civilians. Now, that statement from the Prime Minister said now that the federal police would continue their work of looking for the TPLF's leadership to try and bring them to court. And this leads us to one of the key questions now is where are the TPLF's leaders if they're not in Mekelle? And then secondly, what's happened to the substantial numbers of troops and the military hardware that they control? Now, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's statement said that thousands of soldiers who had been held hostage by the TPLF have now been freed, but we don't know how many more are still under the TPLF's command, and if possibly the TPLF leadership and its fighters and military hardware have fled into the surrounding mountains.
It is an incredibly complex situation, isn't it? And this story has probably got some way to go before it reaches any kind of resolution. But tell us a little bit of how we got to this point.
Well, the TPLF dominated Ethiopia's politics and its military for almost 30 years, until 2 years ago when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took over. That followed nationwide protests in different parts of the country. Abiy Ahmed promised reforms, and as part of those reforms, the Tigrayan leadership, the TPLF, said that they were being unfairly targeted during crackdowns on corruption and past rights abuses. So this led to growing animosity. The TPLF felt they were being squeezed out from the powerful positions that they once held. There was a breakdown in communications. Both sides stopped recognizing each other. That's what led to this armed conflict beginning just over 3 weeks ago. Now, the TPLF began as a guerrilla rebel group hiding out in the mountains around Mekelle and in the Tigray province. They fought and successfully overthrew the regime that came before them, a Marxist regime that dominated Ethiopia in the 1970s and the 1980s. And then after being in control for nearly 30 years, they're now apparently out, according at least to the government side's claims, but they may well have retreated into those very same mountains. And a lot of people fear that, indeed, as you said, this may not be over and there's a chance of a guerrilla war still proceeding from here.
Indeed. All right, Malcolm, thanks for that update. Malcolm Webb there in Nairobi. Well, Dino Matani is the Deputy Director of the Africa Programme at the International Crisis Group, and he says the conflict is not only between Ethiopia's National Army and Tigrayan fighters.
There's also the fact that the Ethiopian army is not necessarily working alone. There are other actors in this conflict between, besides the Ethiopian government forces and the Tigray forces. Diplomats in the region are now confirming the involvement of the Eritrean army. In West Tigray, there have also been allied militia from neighboring Amara region and Amara special forces from the neighboring region. These two regions, Amara and Tigray, also have enmity between them, and there's been contested territories that both their political leaderships have claimed these disputed territories as theirs, and so there's enormous ethnic friction on the ground, and we've seen reports earlier this month of massacres that have taken place in Western Tigray. So, notwithstanding this particular day's military campaign, there's a lot of other actors as part of this conflict who don't answer necessarily directly to Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister.
Well, we've been talking about the tens of thousands of people who've fled the fighting. Let's hear now from Hiba Morgan, who's in the Rakuba camp in Gadaref in Sudan, which is where many of them are being relocated.
Akuba refugee camp here in Sudan's Gadaref state has expanded since it was first opened just over 2 weeks ago. Now, when it was first opened, it hosted about a few hundred Ethiopian refugees fleeing from the conflicts in the Tigray region. Now, the camp hosts more than 7,000 Ethiopian refugees, and this place is becoming sort of a permanent shelter for them until things ease back home and they say it's safe for them to return. Now, this is the only formal refugee camp here in Gadaref state, despite Sudan hosting more than 43,000 Ethiopian refugees over the past 3 weeks escaping from the conflicts in the Tigray region. The other centers, Hamdayet Reception Center in neighboring Kassala state and Lugdi here in Gadaref state, are all just reception centers, including Village 8, which is about 30 kilometers from the Sudan-Ethiopia border that hosts more than 15,000 Ethiopian refugees. Now, most of them here stand under the scorching sun waiting for food aid and waiting for food distribution. But they say that this is much better than being back home, not knowing what they could have faced. Many families speak of leaving their loved ones behind, of witnessing people being slaughtered, of atrocities they say that forced them to flee and come here to Sudan seeking refuge. But aid organizations say that they need help in terms of responding to the influx of refugees. They say that in the coming 6 months, they expect up to 200,000 Ethiopian refugees to come here to Sudan seeking refuge from the Tigray region because of the conflict, should the fighting continue. They say that they need financial assistance or funding for the programs to be able to respond to this refugee crisis that is unfolding, because Sudan as a government, despite hosting them, already hosts nearly 1 million other refugees in various other states and therefore will not be able to cope with this crisis on its own. So while the aid organizations are sounding the alarm and calling for support to be able to respond to this current unfolding refugee crisis, people here say they'll wait to hear until things are safe before they go back home in Tigray region in Ethiopia